A mind is a terrible thing to waste. A nine is terrible in your face. The mace has a terrible fucking taste. The pen is a terrible fucking place. The kings all hate the fucking ace. The judge sabotaged my fucking case. Racist motherfucker. Black police showing out for the white cop.
A few weeks ago, I was driving around on the highway here, I-75, going to Dayton, and a local trucker who had some hazardous material on his truck, and he lost control of his vehicle and he crashed like a total moron. And because I had to clean up this hazardous waste, the highway was shut down for something around 6 hours. And so instead of working for 8 to 9 hours, I ended up working for 12 hours straight, driving around in my cargo van. And as I was driving there, making an illegal U-turn on the highway, being stuck in traffic, angrily maneuvering around cars, I have truly become one with the van. The van was extension of myself, man. But this is not the first deteriorating piece of machinery that I was intimately connected with. Not the first entity that was slowly falling apart that I was united with intimately. Did. I'm not talking about your mom here. I'm talking about the country I was born in. USSR. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. Советский Союз. I was born in a country that occupied 1/6 of the Earth's surface, that had close to 300 million people in it. The country that sent the first man into space, the first dog into space, and even the first lady into space. The country that created the first international space station, that broke the back of the German offensive with millions of lives. A country that could produce cutting-edge military equipment but was unable to ship kielbasa to the local store. A country that killed millions in famines and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in political repressions. A country whose ideology proclaimed it to be the vanguard of humanity, leading it into the bright future without oppression, without unfulfilled wants, without misery, poverty, and pain. I was born in there, man, in the same country as Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, fucking Estonia. These were all my countrymen, whether they wanted to be or not. We were one people, one Soviet people. And now it's gone, man. Where's the Soviet Union? What happened to it? Well, thankfully, there's this video to explain it. And you might say, who are you to tell me this story? Are you a historian? No, I'm not. I'm not a fucking historian. Is that clear? You motherfucker were too lazy to fucking skim through the Wikipedia entry for Mikhail Gorbachev. I know you, you lazy piece of shit. I'm not even gonna bring up the Wikipedia entry for Boris Yeltsin that you wouldn't be even able to spell to look for that swine-faced Slav who changed history. Okay, man, so this is the explainer you deserve. Need I say any more? I'm not fucking Three Arrows, okay? I have a different fucking accent. We don't do fucking... We do broad brushes here. We do fucking slow strokes. We don't do the fucking German fucking hyper-information shit. We look for the big themes, for the archetypes, for the lobsters under the rock. So please join me. In order to understand how and why the Soviet Union collapsed, we have to remember what the Soviet Union actually was. Oh, look at this. What's that in my lap? That's right. It's the imperial banner of the Russian Empire. So here you have the double-headed eagle and of the Romanov dynasty, surrounded by different subjects of the empire. You see, you have Poles always complaining about oppression, but they occupy a fucking prime feather over here, a prime fucking imperial feather, and yet they're still always bitching, always fucking unhappy with different shit. So this banner represents orthodox imperial configuration, the mother country at the core, and then the grateful imperial subjects around it, with the Tsar as the universal sovereign. Now, of course, when Bolsheviks took over the empire, when Bolsheviks were consolidating their power and reclaiming former Russian imperial lands for themselves, the double-headed eagle of the Romanov Empire was no longer flight-proof. I mean, we know what happened to the actual Romanovs. But beside that, the whole vibe isn't a socialist vibe. It's just not a communist vibe. The Bolsheviks, Lenin, Stalin, and the rest of them had to reconfigure the schema. They had to rebrand the empire. They were in the business of rebranding the whole configuration. You can no longer have imperial subjects. You have to have equals, at least hypothetically. You have to have people united to build socialism and communism on this land. And in order to do that, they have assigned republics to all major nationalities. And they had to downgrade Russia from the status it enjoyed of being the sun around which all the planets rotate. They had to downgrade that on the level of ideology. In fact, as you may have noticed, the word Russia appears nowhere in the name of the country. The Soviet Union implies a union of these republics. It's almost like Bolsheviks have given these people their own republic, their own nation in a sense, their own kind of country. And then all of these grateful people have decided to join in this new project of the Soviet Union. Each Soviet republic enjoyed its own sweet flag, its own territory, of course, and its own republican government. Now, this republican government was composed of the local ethnicity of the local people. But of course, it took all of its marching orders from the Kremlin, and all the promotions were handled by the Kremlin as well. And yet, nevertheless, it did create a sense of self-rule, even if not the reality. You can't say that this rebranding of an empire, this abandonment of the colonial mentality for the mentality of equal people joining together on this important project, on this historical undertaking, that this was a complete and total failure. Back in 2013, the Gallup organization has conducted a number of polls in 11 former Soviet republics. And the question was simple. The breakup of the Soviet Union, did it bring more harm than good? And in 7 out of 11 republics here, one of them being Russia, admittedly, the answer of harm prevailed over the idea that the collapse of the Soviet Union brought benefit. So back in 2013 in Armenia, 66% said that more harm was brought. Kyrgyzstan, 61% harm. Ukraine at the time registered at 56% harm. Russia at 55%, Tajikistan 52%, Moldova 42%, with 26 saying that there was more benefit. That doesn't mean that these countries now want to be ruled from the Kremlin today, or that they completely regret independence. But it also attests to the fact that at least the older generation perceived themselves as being legitimate parts of one big country. I'm not here to justify the Soviet Union in any way whatsoever. I'm happy it no longer exists. But these distinctions need to be understood. Distinctions between the core Soviet republics in their perception of the Soviet Union versus countries in the Warsaw Pact, like obviously Poland and Czechoslovakia, Hungary and others, that were put in the Soviet sphere of influence after the Red Army marched through them on the way to Berlin, that there is a difference in perception of the Soviet Union in that the people living in core Soviet republics, at least many of them, didn't perceive themselves to be trapped under the ruthless Russian boot. The word Soviet in Russia means council, Soviet. So you would say the city council would be the city Soviet, городской Soviet. If I wanted to ask you for advice, I would say I went to get a Soviet. Пошел попросить совета. That's what the word means. And Lenin had the slogan, all power to the Soviets. And the Soviets in this configuration meant the councils of peasants or workers that would then rule the country. Of course, the representation of the country, the hammer and sickle, shows the union of the worker and the peasant working together to bring socialism. In reality, because of the needs of industrialization, rapid industrialization in the Soviet Union, it was all built on the backs of peasants. Peasants were really treated like cattle. In fact, Stalin took away their internal passport. Now you would ask, what the fuck is an internal passport? Well, it's your ID that you use to travel in the country. In order to move from one place to another, you would need a passport. And when Stalin took away passports of the peasants, he prevented them from leaving their area, making them, in fact, indentured servants, serving the needs of the state, which was transferring resources, food, etc., out of the countryside and to the cities in order to fucking build the glorious future. So this whole thing with the Soviets was bullshit from the start. But when Bolsheviks were weak, when they didn't enjoy the complete control over the country, they needed to have these slogans or these ideas about the Soviets. Later on, the Soviets were completely taken over by the party and were just cogs in the totalitarian machine. There was no fucking rule of the Soviets ever. But that's where the name comes from. At the core of the Soviet state was, of course, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, КПСС, Коммунистическая партия Советского Союза. It was just called the party. Everybody called it the party, which is rational when you live in a one-party state. So the way that the communists justified their totalitarian rule was with the notion that there was a flow of history, right? If you really understand Marxism, the idea isn't that we have this economic theory that can compete with other theories of economics. There is no real pluralism if you look deeply in Marxism. And the reason for that is because Marxists believe that they are the vanguard of history. Communists believe that they are the embodiment of the natural flow of history. Karl Marx outlined the notion that history has progressed, humanity has progressed through clashes of different classes throughout history. Different classes would battle, and eventually, explicitly or implicitly, one would prevail. And that capitalism was just one stage in human history, where the capitalists were battling the proletariat, and the proletarians would win and inevitably move in the direction of communism, which would be the end of history when the notion of private property would be abandoned, and people would live in a state of strange abundance where everybody would be fulfilled according to their need. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that works, but if you truly believe in it, then you're not just competing with other parties, you are the masters of destiny. You are the embodiment of history. The revolution that you create, it's not a historical process as much as it is almost a scientific one. And when you are the catalyst of this change, when you're at the middle of this tsunami, why do you need to consult anybody else? From the Bolshevik point of view, the party itself was the embodiment of the will of the people. The party itself, by definition, was totally democratic. because it represented the will of the people, the true will of the people. And this is why the main newspaper of the Communist Party was called Pravda, which is truth. It's literally, the newspaper is literally called truth. And if you have one newspaper that is the embodiment of truth, why do you need other competing points of view? If the party is the people, then who are the enemies of the party? Motherfucker, they're the enemies of the people. The traitors and pieces of shit. Different fucking cunts and assholes. Trotskyist saboteurs and shit. Fucking Japanese spies, German spies, American spies. They're the kinds of assholes who, when you work at an office, they fucking shit in there and don't even clean up their shit. They don't flush enough. And so you walk in and you look at that shit stain, and that's who they are. They don't respect the collective. Motherfucker, let them freeze their ass in Siberia and learn what work really is and really reflect on what they have done, unless they fucking have a bullet in their chest, in which case, what are you gonna do? Some prisoners in the gulags during Stalin's reign, they actually would tattoo pictures of Stalin and Lenin on their chest with the belief that nobody would shoot at them. But I'm pretty sure they shot them as well, if they really needed to. But that is the explanation of the totalitarian rule. It is what Lenin called the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is the foundation, the ideological foundation of the one-party state in the Soviet Union. Now here in this presentation, I'm not going to focus too much on comrade taxidermy or the Georgian with a pet pony named treason. We're going to move closer to the collapse of the Soviet Union and kind of brush over them for the most part. But I would like to talk about the death of the father of the Soviet people. Now, Stalin was paranoid, and people were around him were terrified of him, afraid of him. And one time, Comrade Stalin didn't show signs of activity at his normal schedule. He didn't start his work in the morning, didn't interact with anybody, but people were afraid to go up and check on him. Finally, when they did, they found Stalin laying around in a pool of his own urine, still alive. He had a stroke. Stalin had a stroke. But because people didn't react soon enough, it kind of deteriorated his condition. Now, when Stalin was on his deathbed, it is said that he looked around at the comrades standing around his bedside and raised his arm and did one of these shits, kind of a menacing thing. And this led to speculation, among other things, that he was poisoned. The idea was Stalin was growing increasingly agitated toward the end of his life, and he started persecuting people again. I mean, he always did, but people were afraid that this was a new wave. And before he could shoot up a new round of communists, because this is what Stalin loved to do. Nobody killed more communists than Stalin, because he was afraid of them. And sometimes he would shoot many of them up. I mean, he killed many of the early Bolsheviks who could challenge him once he assumed power. And he would kill communists throughout. And that fearing this, they've poisoned him. This is highly unlikely, I don't believe it. Anyway, he was dead. And then there was a power struggle within the higher echelons of the Communist Party. And Nikita Khrushchev prevailed. And many of Stalin's acolytes were shot. Now, I myself am not going to shed a lot of salty tears over their demise. Let's take Lavrentiy Beria. He headed the KGB predecessor, NKVD. Not only was he a horrible human being who destroyed lives, but he was actually also a rapist. He would drive around Moscow, or was driven around, and he would see a girl and, would invite actresses into his residence, and they knew what to do. And if they didn't know, it happened anyway. He was a piece of shit. The person who ascended was Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was, of course, not there by accident. He was one of Stalin's henchmen. He used to be in charge of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, in charge of Ukraine during political repressions. And as he himself has admitted, privately of course, his hands were up to his elbows in blood. But during a famous Soviet Congress, he actually condemned Stalin and Stalinism. All the statues of Stalin were removed. The city of Stalingrad was renamed, and throughout the rest of the Soviet Union, you wouldn't see statues of Stalin anywhere. He was condemned for his cult of personality. This was a radical thing to do at the time. And there was even a period called the Thaw, Khrushchev's Thaw. There was an increased, there was some space for freedom of speech, let me put it this way. Publications, certain books by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, certain reflections on the gulags were allowed. Khrushchev has built a more humane USSR. For example, he gave the peasants passports. Now they could actually leave their village, something they couldn't do under Stalin. Khrushchev has shifted some of the Soviet industry toward consumer goods. Nobody had personal cars under Stalin, next to nobody, maybe some party officials. But now it was possible to get one, even though it was a tedious process and still very few people had a car, but nevertheless, certain consumer goods start flowing in. Under Stalin, some people lived in barracks. Literally, whole families lived stuffed in these barracks. And Khrushchev started building new apartment buildings that were called Khrushchevki. I think one of my grandmothers still in Russia lives in one of these. I mean, they're pretty decrepit now, but at the time, certain people had an apartment and private space they never had in their life. A lot of people lived in the Soviet Union in communal apartments. Communal apartment is sort of like a dorm with a shared bathroom, except you live there your whole life with your family. So with very thin walls separating yourself from other families. It was a very strange existence where everybody literally knew everybody's business, because in many cases they could hear them having sex. And now with Khrushchev, that reduced those communal apartments, even though they existed and persevered until the very end of the Soviet Union. There was always a shortage of living space. Nikita Khrushchev, however, was kind of an erratic guy. He was not like the rest. He really poured out his soul in a sense. He really liked to wave his arms and just say what was on his mind.
Еще нам 7 лет, и мы будем на таком же уровне, как Америка. А в следующий пойдем дальше, вперед.
100 лет резерве остается у нас. 100 лет резерве остается.
Но мы, когда вас обгоним на разъезде, мы вам приветствие такое любезное скажем.
There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, you see, you never concede anything.
И в этой технике вас опередили. Американцы умные люди. Мы всегда об этом верили и знали. Ну что, глупые люди не могли бы поднять экономику на такой уровень, которого не достигли. Но мы тоже, знаете, не мух, так сказать, ноздрями бьем. А за 42 года, знаете, так шагнули навсегда, что достойные партнеры.
And not everybody liked it. He was a bit erratic. He was kind of erratic. It wasn't just the Americans who were terrified when he moved the missiles to Cuba, but it was also his comrades in the party. They watched him bang his shoe in the United Nations.
Khrushchev continued his boisterous, boorish tactics. Britain's Prime Minister Macmillan was but one of his targets.
Khrushchev created several interruptions, shouting and pounding on his desk.
They listened to long speeches he had about agriculture. He really thought he was a great expert and he would just go on forever. His strange themes, his strange ideas. about agriculture that he had. He really was a peasant, an uneducated peasant. In fact, he was a certain embodiment of social mobility in the Soviet Union, because it's hard to imagine him being a leader of any other country. He really got to the top through being wily and clever, and perhaps at times pretending to be dumber than he actually was. He wasn't a total buffoon like how people like to present him, but nevertheless he was buffoonish. And once he achieved power, he seemed, I mean, without Stalin holding him by the balls, he really let himself go. He really let his freak out. I mean, he really would do goofy things. He was the first Soviet leader and the first Russian leader to visit the United States. And on this visit, he was taken to see a musical. And there were ladies there dancing around. And at the end of the musical, they asked, you know, what did you think, General Secretary? Oh, he wasn't pleased. He said, I saw these dames dancing around like harlots, shaking their ass. That's what he said. He said, this is really degenerate. And then he, to illustrate it, he kind of lifted the lapels of his jacket and he kind of shook his booty to show what was so upsetting to him. I mean, he would just kind of, you know, just say weird shit like that. And so eventually, really, people in the party got the douche chills from him. And he really did get too comfortable up there. He really kind of let himself go. And so there was a coup against him. And he was replaced.
Я же знаю, что я дело имею с хорошим адвокатом. Поэтому я хочу свою шахтерскую массу, так сказать, тоже, так сказать, чтобы поддержать на высоте. Чтобы шахтеры сказали, вот наш не уступает адвокату.
No question about that.
Вы адвокат капитализма, я адвокат коммунизма. Вот давайте мы посоревнуемся.
All that I can say from the way you talk and the way you dominate the conversation, you would have made a good lawyer yourself.
Now here, my friend, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of your average communist official, of your average bureaucrat, your average apparatchiks. The Communist Party was one of the few ways to really advance in the Soviet Union. Not everybody was a member of the Communist Party. It was a prestigious thing. It was prestigious to be a part of the governing party. However, during Stalin's time, because he had such a lust to kill communists, Stalin did, there was times when nobody would join the party. Like in certain regions where they saw just the head of the party just be shipped off to Siberia. Nobody wanted to join. However, things were different now. First, they were these apparatchiks, these fucking opportunists. They were shaking in their boots. They were pissing themselves because of Stalin. They were terrified. And then they had to listen to this Khrushchev fucking carry on, give speeches forever, wave his fist, creating dangerous nuclear war situation with the adversary. Now they had to deal with this buffoon. So what did they want at this point? They wanted to chill. They wanted stability. They wanted somebody who you could relax with. Somebody with who you could take a breather. And man, did they get that with Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. With Brezhnev. You know, he was just a steady hand. No reforms, no nothing. We're just gonna chill over here. For 18 years. Under Brezhnev, he was the longest Soviet ruler and one of the longest rulers in Russian history after Stalin. However, there's somebody who I'm pretty sure has beat his record by now. Well, it's the boss, you know. He really is gonna outlive Brezhnev as far as being in the Kremlin. Now, one thing Brezhnev didn't do is rock the boat in any way whatsoever. Under him, the Soviet Union has expanded its geopolitical influence. It has invested massive amounts of resources into the military. The lives of average people have improved. Stalin was not talked about that much. He wasn't rehabilitated, but he also wasn't condemned. everything was very kind of stable. Everything was consistent, you could say, in its mediocrity. At one point, Brezhnev and the upper echelons of the Communist Party have entertained the idea of reforms. However, then Czechoslovakia happened. And what happened there was the local communist leader desire to create socialism with a human face has resulted in almost a collapse of the one-party state there. Brezhnev sent in the Red Army in order to restore order. And at that point, they really didn't want to try socialism with a human face. They really had Brezhnev's face. And Brezhnev, over the time of his rule, has turned into Grandpa Brezhnev, Grandpa who would read his communist speeches, receive numerous awards and medals, becoming the hero of the Soviet Union over and over again, the highest prize. And then he turned into the walking corpse Brezhnev. And this is not even an exaggeration, because in the 1970s, he had a clinical death before he got revived. And then he just mostly worked like 2 days a week. And people would come in to see him, and he was barely there. It was kind of ridiculous.
Mikhail Sergeyevich, congratulations. What we started over there,
The
canal, we'll finish from here.
Certainly, Leonid Ilyich.
Brezhnev was giving Gorbachev the Order of the October Revolution, the medal for people on the way up.
You were right, sir, when you said that this award is for our work in Stavropol.
But the reason he held on for so long is because the party loved him so much. You had such a linear way of living if you were a communist apparatchik. You knew how to advance, you knew which asses to kiss, you weren't afraid of any radical changes in your career path. Everything was nice and steady with Leonid Brezhnev. And as he has aged, so have the people around him has aged, because again, he didn't rock the boat, he didn't replace any of the old timers. And ultimately, there was really kind of a group of geriatrics, barely living geriatrics, in charge of the country. It's almost like the whole country was ruled out of a nursing home, because that's what the center of power in the Soviet Union has become. So for my next trick, I will attempt to describe life in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev. Now, of course, I've never lived in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, but my parents have, my grandparents have, I have consulted them, and I also watched a few documentary movies, okay?
С чего начинается Родина? С картинки в твоем букваре.
So let me tell you about it. Now this, what I'm going to read right now, is a Russian joke. There is a tradition of Russian jokes that are called anecdotes, that are way more developed than jokes in the English language that people tell each other. This is not going to be funny for you because you didn't live at the time. It's not super funny for me because I haven't lived at the time. Maybe it's not fucking funny at all, but it's a nice capturing of how people felt at the time. So this joke is a list, and it's called The 6 Main Contradictions of Socialism. So the first one is, there is no unemployment, yet nobody is working. The second one is, nobody is working, yet all the government plans are fulfilled. The third one is, the government plans are fulfilled, and yet there is nothing in the stores. The fourth one is, there's nothing in the stores, yet everybody has everything. And this is a reference to the black market. And the fifth one is, everybody has everything, yet nobody's happy. The sixth contradiction is, nobody's happy, yet everybody is voting yes all the time. And this is a reference to the elections, quote unquote, that were happening in the Soviet Union. So there was a sense of dream walking through life. If you got a job, you could get that job for life. You were hardly paid anything, but you had enough to live on. You had free healthcare, decent healthcare for the most part. And you had free education, decent education, and excellent in certain areas, potentially like math and sciences. And yet there was a sense of cruising through life, because once you had a job, there weren't necessarily a lot of potentialities for advancement. Often you didn't have to work that hard, depended on the needs of the leadership and the inefficient management of resources. So some places had too many workers, etc. Like when my mother graduated from college, she went to a research institute. People there were not doing anything. Some people didn't show up for work for days. Other people were using the computers, which weren't widely available at the time, of course, to play Leisure Suite Larry, which is an old game where you pick up girls. It's like an RPG where you pick up girls. I mean, this is what was going on in many places. Today, the idea of socialism is gaining traction with a lot of people, and I'm not exactly sure what socialism means today to the youth, to the youngsters. What does it mean, socialism? What does it mean to you? I really don't know. Maybe you should sleep with me if you're photogenic and tell me about socialism during pillow talk. But the one aspect of at least the socialism that existed in the Soviet Union, and one challenge of eradicating capitalist economics, is that it's really hard to regulate supply and demand without a market. It's just a very difficult thing to do. Now, the Soviet Union had one organization, Gosplan, government plan, that controlled the whole economy. That is to say, they tried to calculate supply and demand on their own without having the market in real time regulating that stuff. And this proved to be massively inefficient. In addition to that, the people who needed to fulfill the plan were communist officials. Now, they had an interest in fulfilling the plan in order to advance their careers. But of course, in all enterprises, you can't always fulfill the plan. So they just lied about it. And when push come to shove, those things that they were supposed to produce just weren't there. Whereas in other areas, they were produced to excess that nobody needed. And so what this resulted in altogether is continuous deficits of certain products. So for example, sometimes like the toilet paper would just disappear, like you couldn't buy toilet paper in stores. Or sometimes you had to stand in long lines very often. And this is what Soviet people did for huge chunks of their lives, is stand in line for basic necessities. However, usually you could find anything on the black market. However, obviously you would need to pay way above the said government price. And this is what the joke there references with everybody having everything but nobody being happy. The one place that usually was well supplied, almost always was relatively well supplied, was Moscow, my hometown. Now, of course, the reason it was well supplied is because the bulk of Soviet bureaucracy lived there. And it was the capital, and it would be unseemly if the capital itself had a shortage of kielbasa. And so what happened as a result of that is literally hundreds of thousands of people would flock to Moscow to shop there because there were deficits in their provincial regions. And so Muscovites really resented them because they might have had to stand in lines before, but now they had huger lines with a bunch of people from the outside coming there. One thing about the Soviet Union is you didn't have the right of movement. You think about the right of movement, the right of traveling as being kind of universal, but you really didn't have it. So for example, even though I was born in the same country as Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, there are way more Uzbeks and Tajiks in Moscow today than there ever were during the Soviet Union. Because in order to live in Moscow, you needed to have a permit. And this permit was hard to obtain. And so if you were a young up-and-comer And Moscow, of course, is the center of Russia today, and it's a regional center, and it has always been since the capital has moved there from St. Petersburg under Lenin. So it's like they say about New York, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Well, you want to make it in Moscow, man. How do you fucking get there? Well, you could enter a sham marriage to get a permit to live in Moscow. People would literally enter sham marriages in the way that people do to get into the United States just to move to the capital of their country. Kind of absurd. You could register yourself in student housing. You can pay a bribe and pretend to live in student housing when you really didn't live there. So this was another option. You can move to the region and get a permit in the overall Moscow region and then actually live in Moscow. Renting was illegal in the Soviet Union, although it happened, but it was illegal, so you couldn't just rent and expect a permit to live there. No, you would be unregistered. Without a permit, it's very hard to get a job. It would be very difficult to get a job in Moscow first and then get a permit. You would need to be highly qualified specialist that was in deep need in Moscow. The whole period of Brezhnev is described as a period of zastoy, stagnation. Zastoy could refer to like stale water that stands in like some bucket or whatever and begins to go bad. People stood in lines forever, and yet they were also educated, profoundly educated, and knew there was a better life. It was very hard to obtain hipster accessories like jeans, like just getting jeans. Like if you had a nice pair of jeans, they were like highly, profoundly valued. You would be very careful walking around in them. And just having jeans, you know, you would increase your potential of getting laid exponentially. Because it's very, very cool. And the Soviet Union didn't produce jeans. At one point, part of my family, kind of close to me that I'm not going to mention, they lived in Iran for a while. Iran. At the time of the Shah. They worked at the Soviet embassy. And anyway. In any case, when they brought some stuff from Iran, everybody was so fucking jealous that they had different shit like jeans and different fucking clothes, and it was just amazing. They were just the envy of everyone for having gone to Iran and having bought that shit. The economy was pretty inefficient, and you were just kind of cruising through your existence, standing in lines. So that's kind of what was going on. Political repressions were, of course, going on. They weren't to the extent of Stalin. Some people were forcibly kicked out of the country, like Solzhenitsyn, just forced on a plane and kicked out. Other people were sent to war camps. Homosexuality was banned. There were quotas on Jews. So those were the things going on under Brezhnev. Khrushchev, of course, condemned Stalin after his passing for the cult of personality. And under Khrushchev's reign, this idea, this great promotion of a leader, was tamped down. However, it increased drastically under Brezhnev the more decrepit he got. And there is a certain logic to it. The party was really interested in continuing this period of stability for itself and really liked Leonid Brezhnev for that reason. However, he was kind of getting more and more out of there. And yet with time, he got more and more military awards, more medals, more fucking heroes of the Soviet Union, until he looked like a fucking Christmas tree. And that's the idea. It's like, I know you see Brezhnev over there mumbling and seeming like he's gonna fall asleep right now or die, but this man is a fucking legend. You know, Brezhnev is fucking awesome. And this is what the party was doing. This is what was going on. There is a Russian joke from the time when, after the passing of Brezhnev, the kid asks the father, was there a cult of personality around Brezhnev? And the father says, a cult of personality? Of course. But what a personality. Well, anyway, finally, the personality died. Finally, Brezhnev croaked. And he was succeeded by two geriatrics, Andropov and Chernenko. When Chernenko got into the office of the general secretary, he already was barely functioning. He just died very quickly. Very little changed under these two guys, because they fucking died. Reagan joked with his advisors, saying that I want to negotiate with them, but they keep dying on me. Well, finally, Gorbachev was elevated to the post. Somebody who very much showed signs of life. Because there was a realization in the party that things needed to change. That this stagnation cannot persevere forever, and there needs to be a new generation in there. And the one thing that Gorbachev was known for in the party is telling it how it is. He would go to a meeting and usually people would expect rosy assessments of agriculture in Azerbaijan or some shit like that. And when Gorbachev emerged, he would say everything is shitty. I mean, maybe not in these terms, but he was kind of gave himself some leeway to kind of acknowledge the problems in the country. And so finally these geriatrics voted him in, made him the general secretary. And then they came to regret it very, very swiftly. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. Guess what, my dude? By 1991, the Soviet Union was toast. Fucking in 6 years. It's quite of an achievement. Of course, he didn't set out to destroy the Soviet Union in any way. He wanted to reform it and make it stronger. He wanted to make it more ethical. But it turned into an utter disaster. And by the end of this whole thing, he was kind of like a used condom as far as his political relevance. Literally, I mean, he was just kind of tossed aside and became utterly irrelevant. Now, the Russian people really have a lot of ambiguity about Mikhail Gorbachev. Some people really, really hate him. And you can really feel and really note this ambiguity in this Pizza Hut commercial featuring Mikhail Gorbachev.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев.
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Pizza Hut.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
За Горбачева! За Горбачева! За Горбачева! Okay, my friends, let's settle down, let's relax. Now, at every single video that I looked up to research this shit, every single Russian video and documentary that I looked at about the collapse of the Soviet Union, you can see some comments that are not fond of Gorbachev. And they usually go like this. Fucking Gorby, fucking traitor. I wish you could be hung on a noose. You and Yeltsin. I mean, literally stuff like that. On every single one of the videos. Now, as a proud pseudo-Russian, pseudo-American who has lived now in America for most of my life, I disapprove of that. These are not my liberal sentiments. But people now really hate Gorbachev. And yet they had so much faith in him when he first appeared on the scene. When Gorbachev first became the general secretary, he did something that none of them have done before to the same extent. And some of them to non-extent whatsoever. In that he went to the masses and started interacting with them on the street as if he was an elected politician, as if he had something to prove to them, as opposed to having them just listen to his diktats. He was treating the Soviet people like citizens. And at this time, this was extremely popular. This is something that people have never seen before. And for the first 2 years of his rule, he was one of the most genuinely popular Soviet leaders in the history of that country. He really did well in that sense. And after undertaking these and having these adventures and interactions with the average babushka and etc., he gotten more confidence to undertake his reforms. And his first and most important reform that really started to destroy the Soviet Union immediately, even though, again, this was not his intent whatsoever, was glasnost. Glasnost. There is no direct translation, but it's kind of openness, or the freedom to proclaim, you can say. It comes from the word proclaim, kind of a thing. Well, anyway, it's just freedom of speech. He has instituted the relaxation of government censorship. People were no longer persecuted for what they said. So before I go any further, I have to highlight one very important thing, is that all of these reforms, all of Gorbachev's reforms and experiments were taking place in the midst of a huge economic crisis. This was more than the regular Soviet deficits of waiting for a few hours to get toilet paper or kielbasa or whatever. This was growing beyond that. And the reason for that has to do with the old Soviet and now Russian weakness, over-reliance on natural resources that the Reagan administration has taken advantage of to kick the Soviet Union in the balls. Now, one thing that the Soviet Union was trying to do was to create another entry into the European energy market by building another natural gas pipeline into Europe. Obviously, a huge undertaking that needed technology that the Soviet Union didn't have. And Reagan placed very strict restrictions, effectively banned the transfer of that technology to the Soviet Union. Another aspect was the price of oil that basically collapsed in the 1980s. Now, it is said that there was an agreement between Saudi Arabia and America to pump out maximum amounts of oil to lower its price to hit the Soviet Union. For me, it's kind of sounds like science fiction that these fucking Saudis would reduce the price of oil and lose revenue as a result of it. But maybe this is true. Maybe they did hate the Soviet Union and felt threatened by it to that extent after the invasion of Afghanistan. In any case, the price of oil dropped profoundly. And so now, in the midst of these Gorbachev's reforms, this is going on. Now, Gorbachev initiated his reforms in order to counteract the stagnation under Brezhnev, but also to fix the economy. But in fact, the economy worsened throughout Gorbachev's reign, worsened to a horrible degree, undermining his popularity, undermining his ability to initiate reforms or even to control situation and even his basic legitimacy as the ruler and the legitimacy of the state, the Soviet state as a whole. As I have pointed out, I have been born in the same country as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan. Need I go on? Actually, I fucking forget the Baltic states. I fucking forget them. I forget them. But that is, of course, the strength of communist propaganda. All these people marching together toward the progressive future. In fact, the Soviet Union tried to supersede the Soviet identity over an ethnic identity. We were all Soviet people. We were the Soviet nation. Self-identification as a Soviet person was supposed to triumph over petty squabbles of nationalism. But of course it didn't. Of course it didn't. America is the only country that truly was able to pull this off on a grand scale. The idea of being an American superseding your ethnicity. But of course, America doesn't consist of territories housing specific ethnicities that have been there for centuries. It is a nation of immigrants. The Soviet Union was a nation of republics under the heel of the Communist Party. And once the heel relaxed, all these things began to unravel. When Gorbachev introduced the glasnost and the freedom of speech, what was he expecting? Well, it's hard to say because he really didn't plan this shit out. He was the creature of the Soviet Union. He was born in this country, and while he could imagine perhaps Germany reunifying, communism collapsing in Poland and Hungary, etc., I think it was very difficult, it was beyond him to really imagine the Soviet Union breaking apart, because this is the only country he has known. And he thought that even if you relax the reins, there is a legitimacy to this country, there is a perception that is unmovable about it. But he was wrong. It's either that or it's either that or nothing, because his intention was not to destroy the Soviet Union. It seems like he was a little bit naive. He wanted to say, hey, I'm the good Tsar, I gave you freedom. And then people say, we love you, good Tsar, we love you, Tsar Mikhail. But that didn't happen. Eventually they raised the two fingers over there, gave him the two-finger salute to their fucking good Tsar. And he lost control of the situation. It's almost like giving the freedom of speech to people would help him legitimize his rule, would reinvigorate the Soviet Union, and fucking give some fresh air to it. But that fucking, it was a wind that fucking blew the whole thing away. So let's unravel the progression of events, the rational progression of events. You are the leader of a totalitarian state. There is no manual for reforming that state. In fact, a state like the Soviet Union has never existed and is unlikely to exist in the future. It is a unique entity, something utterly unique. And now you give people the freedom of speech. They no longer have to be afraid. You gave them an element of citizenship. But there's something lacking in this element, and that's the ability to yourself initiate real change. You can talk to the party, you can talk to the government, and it will no longer punish you for criticizing it. But you don't really have any levers of power. There are no institutions you can really take advantage of. And so the only thing that was left for people to do is to criticize the government, of course. That's the only fucking thing they can do. There's nothing else they can possibly do. And the situation, of course, is disintegrating. Nationalism is beginning to rear its head across the Soviet Socialist Republic. People want more autonomy, more power away from the central government. And what is standing between them and the fulfillment of that? What is standing there? It's, of course, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party was not a party in any real sense. It was just an institution. It was a pipeline for advancement. The state was just kind of like an empty vessel holding the party. In fact, when we say that Stalin or Gorbachev were the general secretaries, they weren't the general secretaries of the Soviet Union. They were the general secretaries of the party, the governing party. The party and its ideology is above the state. What is the point of the state if it's not building communism? There is no point in it. So of course they had to take aim at the party. But of course the party is the foundation of Gorbachev's rule. And it doesn't work out for Gorbachev. It's not a great equation. In the meantime, the economy is getting worse. Now Gorbachev has tried reforming the economy and tried to introduce some market aspects to it. Now it was much easier for the Chinese and other countries like that to introduce market economy into their system. And there is a big reason for that. It is because they are monolithic. They have one dominant ethnicity. All the other ethnicities are dwarfed by the Han Chinese. And the revolution in China always had a nationalistic tint. It was always about standing up from its knees after centuries of colonialism and humiliation. So they had a legitimacy in a sense, or an ideological foundation beyond communism. The Soviet Union, as the original communist state, was not based in Russian nationalism. In fact, Russian nationalism itself was suppressed because so many of the rulers of the Soviet Union, or specifically Stalin, was not an ethnic Russian. And because one of the key components of Russian nationalism is the Russian Orthodox Church, in the same way that Catholicism is integral to Polish nationalism. And so even though the Russian culture was the governing culture, Russian nationalism was in no way the foundation of the Soviet state. In fact, the Soviet state crushed Russian nationalism in any political form whatsoever. And so for the country that invented communist governing to abandon socialism entirely was much less feasible. And then if you open up your industry to the free market, a lot of it is just not competitive. And if you try to reform industry within the Soviet Union, then that's a difficult task because it has been working in the contents of government plans. It was a part of a huge bureaucracy, and people that are not used to operating a business. They have lived in a country where private property in many cases was outlawed, where conducting business was illegal. And so what Gorbachev did is, it's kind of an idealistic idea to give the workers the power to rule their enterprises, to give the workers the power to elect their boss of their factory, etc. However, this creates a semi-political process, and it naturally gave advantage to the existing party bosses who effectively use these elections to control these factories. And once somebody is in control of the factory and can fire you or do whatever, and then it's pretty hard to fucking replace them. And again, these are not the people who are used in any way to navigate in a market economy. And with nationalism and with different republics pulling away from the Soviet Union, and with all the chaos, Gorbachev didn't have a lot of time to really focus on the economy. It continued to disintegrate. So with people finally complaining about the fact that the Communist Party still has totalitarian rule, using their freedom of speech to lay siege to the legitimacy of the total power of the Communist Party, Gorbachev divorced it from government and renamed himself from General Secretary to President of the Soviet Union. He was the first and last president of the Soviet Union. When the last Russian Revolution happened, an observer described the Russian Empire as an autocracy without an autocrat, meaning that Tsar Nicholas II was an incompetent ruler. And in this case, Gorbachev wanted to preserve a totalitarian regime without a totalitarian ideology and without a total control, without a one-party state. So what was he doing? He's just an idealist, really. If you ever listen to Gorbachev in Russian, you get a kind of a goofy sense to him. A sense of like a self-confident, optimistic college professor who's kind of detached from everyday life and realities, who can just kind of carry on about different political theories and think that they're applicable to the real world when they're not, but defined by kind of an optimistic self-confidence, a kind of cluelessness.
Your popularity here in my country and in the United States, just south of us, is much higher than it is in your native Russia. Can you tell us what it is like to be admired more by the people who used to be your enemies than by those who used to be your fellow homelanders?
20 лет мне задают этот вопрос.
Well, I've been asked this question for 20 years, and if I live for another 20 years, well, I'll be 75, of course, next year. But anyway, probably will be asked this question, but certainly it's the same question. And they asked me about the presidential election in which I got less than 1% of the vote in 1996. Well, first of all, let me tell you that the situation is changing. It's changing quite rapidly. It's been 20 years since the beginning of perestroika, and the polls show that people understand the need for perestroika a lot more. In Russia, of course, the heaviest blow was the breakup of the Soviet Union. That really was a heavy blow, and 60% of as economists believe that 60% of the problems that we are facing today are because of the breakup of the Union. And many people think that it was because of perestroika that Gorbachev broke up the country. It is, of course, the interruption of perestroika that was the first step toward the breakup. In perestroika, we thought that we could preserve the Union while decentralizing it, while giving more rights to the republics, to the regions.
And I'm not saying that I dislike Gorbachev or I have a nostalgia for Soviet Union, which I fucking never experienced except from like some Soviet candies and textbooks that said Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live forever. I have no nostalgia and I'm happy that it no longer exists, the Soviet Union. However, considering that Gorbachev actually wanted to preserve it, he was kind of a goof. I mean, when he opened up his speeches about freedom of speech, about perestroika and glasnost, he would often quote Lenin. He would say, Lenin said that our greatest asset is that we speak the truth. And so now everybody could speak their truth. In fact, Lenin said all the power to the Soviets, and by subtracting the Communist Party from the Soviets, from the councils, he gave all the powers to the Soviets. And the Soviets destroyed the Soviet Union. They destroyed the Soviet Union. Now he was a fucking president without a political base, because the liberals wanted him to do more reforms, etc. And the hardliners in the Communist Party wanted him to reverse the whole thing. And he was kind of dithering between these two without a clear plan and growing more irrelevant in power with every day. Countries in the Baltic states, etc., were now proclaiming independence. Others were more assertive. And what do you do at this point? How do you preserve the state when you have opened up freedom of speech? I mean, we know how old school Soviet Union would preserve it with force. Now with the freedom of speech, unless you want to reverse yourself, you want to reverse your image in the West as being the great democratizer, what do? Well, Gorbachev actually tried the old Soviet way. Gorbachev does have some blood on his hands, because the Soviet authorities repressed demonstrations in Georgia and Azerbaijan with dozens of people dead. When the Baltic states proclaimed their independence, a special division of the KGB, a militarized arm of the KGB, was sent in to quash it and to take control of the television tower. And I think 17 people have died there. And Gorbachev always tried to distance himself from it. He said, I wasn't sure who made these decisions, it's a big mystery. But it was he who made these decisions. And he was entertaining a forceful quash of disintegration of the Soviet Union. There are minutes from his meetings, closed-off meetings obviously, with the other higher-ups in the Soviet Union, where they were describing the Tiananmen Square massacre. Somebody said that 3,000 people died in there. And Gorbachev said, well, listen, they were protecting their interests, meaning the Chinese government. And we can protect our interests too. At one point, Gorbachev said, "Процесс пошел." The process has started. And ever since then, people were making fun of him. This was kind of a joke. The process has started. Because he no longer was in control of the process whatsoever. He was being swept away. And now in his final years in power, as president of the Soviet Union, not the general secretary of the Communist Party, in his final years in power, what he tried to do is to legitimize the Soviet Union under new grounds, to have the Soviet Union be kind of like a federation or a confederacy of states that had more autonomy, on the other hand, were still part of this greater union. So as you can see, this doesn't make a lot of sense. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. Elections were instituted in Soviet republics, and there is one republic in particular that's very important to the core of the Soviet Union, to its foundation, And that's, of course, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia. Elections were instituted there, and now there was an elected head of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, I forget what his official title was at the time. I think the head of the Supreme Soviet of Russia or something like that. But that person was Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was a very advanced communist, a very higher up official who really had a great instinct for power. And when the winds of change came, a lot of these Soviet officials were really not used to being politicians. They really weren't used to going out there in the masses and winning legitimacy there for agitating in the masses. They were used to sucking balls, frankly. They were used to sucking balls and knowing which balls to suck and saying kind of stale speeches about the coming of communism, etc. But not Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin became the second prominent politician in Russia after Gorbachev. He really got in there. And what he did is something that a lot of apparatchiks and bureaucrats were unwilling to do, is to take risks. And he took risks by becoming the biggest critic of Gorbachev and the stagnation of his reforms. He was the biggest one urging the reforms forward. When a politician has no power, effectively no institutional power, then you win through criticism, you win through aggressive criticism. And as the economy is disintegrating, people were attracted to Yeltsin because he was the most decisive person promising the best change.
Он любит власть и не любит, и не может переваривать тех, кто ему противоречит. Он их выгоняет или избегает с ними вести дело. Конкретный пример перед вами.
And now he wasn't just a critic, a prominent critic, little real authority. He was now the head of the biggest republic in the Soviet Union. It's kind of like, imagine if the state of New York occupied 1/3 of America or more, and there was a president of New York and a president of the United States of America. Well, that's a prescription for conflict. The duties of the president, well, of the head of Russia at the time, versus the president of the Soviet Union weren't well outlined. Who controls the natural resources? Who controls the economy? Who controls the military? This was problematic, and of course they started to clash. Now at this point, Gorbachev wanted to sign, this was 1991, he wanted to sign a new legitimation of the Soviet Union, a new Soviet agreement between the republics, giving them more independence and, of course, preserving the Soviet Union. Now, before that, Yeltsin passed a law that said that Russia had sovereignty. So what this meant wasn't that Russia was leaving the Soviet Union, but that Russian laws were trumping Soviet laws. Around the time that they were preparing to sign this new Soviet agreement, the hardliners were having enough of it. They were seeing the disintegration of their country, of their motherland. They were burning with hatred for the dithering Gorbachev that destroyed the country. And they staged a coup. Gorbachev was vacationing in Crimea, of all places, relaxing, when he was informed that there is a emergency committee that's going to take power. GKChP, the emergency committee, it consisted of the Minister of Defense, Minister of the KGB, and 2 other hardliners. And they went on television. At first, all of the television was shut down, and instead of news, people saw a broadcast of Swan Lake, the ballet. People didn't know what the fuck was going on. But then the news anchor announced that Gorbachev was in poor health. Temporarily, there is a committee, an emergency committee, that's going to take control of the country.
The coup leaders hold a press conference. Gorbachev's vice president, Yanayev, tries to justify their actions.
I can't agree that this is an anti-government coup. In due time, we'll publish a medical statement on Gorbachev's health.
Isolated in Foros under house arrest but in perfectly good health, Gorbachev watches the press conference on TV with his family and personal aide, Chinayev.
Gorbachev told me that he didn't think they would succeed, but he was afraid that if they managed to hold on for 1 or 2 weeks, that people would get used to it.
The emergency committee sent troops into Moscow, sent the Red Army into Moscow to quash the collapse of the Soviet Union, to destroy this agreement. Tanks have surrounded the White House in Russia. It was the headquarters of the Russian government at the time. And here comes Yeltsin, and he climbs on top of the tank and condemns the emergency committee.
The coup leaders send in their crack KGB SWAT team, Alpha Group, to take care of Yeltsin. Colonel Goncharov was deputy commander of Alpha.
Our men knew we weren't going on an outing. It was a mission, and we knew the objective of the mission. Capture Yeltsin on his way to Moscow, or, in an extreme case, liquidate him.
As Alpha surrounds Yeltsin's villa, he knows that there is only one chance for him and the country. He must make it back to Moscow and the White House, the Russian parliament.
After we saw the cars of Yeltsin and his escort leave, we reported back to headquarters and asked for instructions. We were ordered to let the cars proceed to Moscow.
This is the coup leader's biggest mistake. Within hours of the launch of the coup, Yeltsin is opening an extraordinary session of the Russian parliament and rallying resistance to the coup dictatorship. As the tension heats up, Yeltsin's head of state security, Ivanenko, calls one of the coup leaders.
I called and asked him, Vladimir Alexandrovich, what's happening? He said, oh, we have to restore order. I said, don't you realize people will take to the streets? He said, ironically, for Gorbachev? I said to him, you're taking a gamble sending tanks to the White House. He replied, history will be our judge. And he hung up.
Muscovites take to the streets to fight the coup. Only a few short years before, under the Communist Party's dictatorship, any such action was unthinkable. Now they are gathering around the White House by the tens of thousands, ordinary Russians. They have tasted freedom and are unwilling to let it slip away. Yeltsin seizes the initiative. He will appeal directly to the people of Russia.
I am fully convinced that our countrymen will not let the coup leaders establish an anarchic and unlawful regime. We appeal to the army and to all patriots not to take part in this reactionary anti-government coup.
"9 hours into the coup. The coup leaders need to silence their main opponent, Yeltsin. They've ordered the army to besiege him in the White House, but the army faces an unexpected challenge. Undeterred by the tanks, the people of Moscow construct barricades in defense of the White House. Anything and everything is commandeered: bricks, drain pipes, cars, and even streetcars.
Emergency committee lost legitimacy. The troops, many of the troops switched sides. Gorbachev was released from his house arrest in Crimea, and he went back to the Kremlin. Gorbachev left for Crimea, the president of the USSR, but he came back a big fucking cuck, because it was Yeltsin who took control. It was definitely brave of Yeltsin to do what he did, but in a sense he had no choice. Because, of course, if the communist hardliners have succeeded, then he would be the first on the chopping block. But nevertheless, it was clear who the alpha was at this time. Gorbachev was, like I crudely said before at this point, basically a used condom.
The next day in the Russian parliament, Yeltsin rammed home his victory.
Вот Борис Николаевич мне сейчас, когда уже мы встретились, он дал краткое изложение заседания Кабинета министров, но я ее еще не читал.
In a few months, the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine met in Belarus and dissolved the Soviet Union, replacing it with a union of independent states, which effectively doesn't have a central government, is basically kind of like a regional organization. Doesn't have any relevance. Now, this wasn't exactly super popular. It's not like all Russians were ready to part with the Soviet Union, the country where they grew up, that they consider their motherland. But the way that Yeltsin explained it is that Ukraine didn't want to be a part of the Soviet Union, and without Ukraine, which was the second largest state, it was meaningless for Russia to remain. The interesting part about this decision to dissolve the Soviet Union without, of course, Gorbachev knowing about it, is that a lot of the other countries, a lot of the other republics in the Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan, you know, pretty huge republics, Uzbekistan, whatever, they weren't informed about it. So they just kind of, you know, found out they were no longer a part of the Soviet Union when the whole thing concluded. Gorbachev gave his final speech as the president of USSR, a kind of a bizarre event in and of itself. And even before he finished the speech, Yeltsin ordered the lowering of the Soviet red flag and the raising of the Russian flag. And that was it, my friends. In 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So that's the finale of my presentation of this. If anybody's still watching, here's the reason it fell apart. Because to introduce freedom of speech in a totalitarian state with multiple ethnicities in there is to destroy that state, unless you want to reverse the freedom of speech. People say that the economic pressure from the United States, the arms race, etc., ruined the Soviet Union. I say it isn't so, because that's approaching the Soviet Union as a democratic state where economic pressure results in the fall of the government. But that's not how totalitarian states work if they remain totalitarian. That is to say, there were famines, multiple famines under Stalin, and the regime was as strong as ever. There were multiple famines in North Korea. Nobody could say that North Korea had a better economy than the Soviet Union. No. Of course, once Gorbachev started these reforms, the economic crisis exacerbated his delegitimization. But that's only once he started them. So he is the prime mover. It was Gorbachev. What did he want? I think he wanted something like the United Soviet States of Sweden, a kind of a welfare state, the control by the government of large industry, but a free market in other aspects. The Soviet Union would no longer create the toothpaste and the toothbrush, but would still control large industry. In a way, the reason the Soviet Union fell is because Gorbachev believed in it too much. He believed that it had intrinsic legitimacy, absent totalitarian rule. And it also fell because of Joseph Stalin, because he created this post, the General Secretary, where all the power was concentrated. And even though coups were possible, it was the only way to change power. And because of that concentration of power, процесс пошел. You know, the process that started from Gorbachev, and his decisions, even though they weren't supported by the majority of the hardline Communist Party, they defined the day. And this also defined the history of China as well. Of course, they did have Tiananmen Square, but also looking at the disintegration of the Soviet Union in real time, they decided to go for economic reforms and not political reforms. They established a group decision-making process where one person couldn't dominate decision-making, where it was more collegial and Confucian in a way. But of course, the current president of China has reversed that and is now consolidating power, which is a historical event in and of itself. We'll see how that turns out, my dudes. Ha. Ha 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 ha. Anyway, a lot of things they didn't talk about, like Boris Yeltsin, in depth. In the end, Putin has described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe, in the 20th century. I beg to differ. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not a victory for democracy. It was a victory for nationalism, because a lot of the people who ended up heading former Soviet republics were themselves former Soviet officials who still followed authoritarian rules and sometimes established dictatorships that were no less and maybe even more brutal than one that existed under Brezhnev. The economy, of course, fully collapsed under Yeltsin. He did cancel out price controls. What resulted is that now Russians didn't have to stand in line for kielbasa. They just couldn't fucking afford it. And their whole Soviet savings were wiped out. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about too much about 1990s Russia. If this channel ever gains any relevancy, I might do a long series about the rise to power of Vladimir Putin, and then that would be a more appropriate topic. And in any case, I've been fucking rambling forever. But yeah, there is a lot of tragedy in the collapse of the Soviet Union, not because the Soviet Union was great, but because such radical change creates radical tragedies, including wars between the people who were former Soviet citizens, who were part of the Soviet nation, of the Soviet people, that many people, not just Russians, wanted to believe in. But with the introduction of freedom, it turned out to be a facade. That's it. До свидания, друзья.
And a sword, so now he is a cyborg snail. Thank you for watching. Be sure to roundhouse kick that like button and subscribe. See you next time. Bye.